Yeah, so this was an issue brought up by Rama, but I think it has wider implications. So I wanted to bring it up here. Basically, what the specific request was to allow WASM to match on path. I feel like we should not do that, but we should enable the use case. And I'm wondering if we should kind of have a larger effort on enhancing the policy attachment. Like we've talked a lot about allowing things to attach to routes. That actually doesn't solve this use case because what they're talking about is for inbound stuff. So I wonder if we should start working on this, but also tackle both problems and try and come up with a way to, do this kind of thing for inbound routes as well, and then also do the outbound route attachment. Or maybe that's the wrong way to do it, and we should have some other way. But I'd like to come up with a way to avoid adding a bunch of different matching things to every single different API instead of having one kind of cohesive way to match things. So I want to bring that up, see if people agree, if they have thoughts on how to do it, if they want to work on it, if we should do it, but we should also, do this as a short-term thing or whatever.
Well, there is no short-term thing. Let's stop using the word short-term because in Istio there is no such thing. Whatever we do will be permanent. It will be V1 from start. You are the second person that makes this claim that we cannot do routing on inbound. Can you explain a bit why we can't?
I mean, from a theoretical standpoint, there's no reason you can't apply a route on inbound. From an implementation standpoint, we don't apply routes on inbound. So,
I mean, we don't apply because we do a pass-through on inbound, and we, just choose to configure it in this way because it's easier and we didn't have it. But it's not. There is no reason the inbound cannot have a, HTTP listener that has routes attached and does anything necessary, same as a waypoint, which will also be consistent with what we do for waypoints, what we do for gateways. It will do a lot of simplifications in a lot of places if we did it. It's not a dramatic change.
Yep. We need to go define how that works, an API around it, all that stuff. But yeah, it's certainly possible. I will say, as a reference point, Linkerd does attach routes to inbound, but they have a route with no backend. So you can't actually override the backend. You can just use it to do matching to apply various filters.
If you remember, we discussed in the past the idea of inbound detecting, for example, that the workload is overloaded, like you can only handle 1,000 QPS, and somehow load balancer send more, and then shifting traffic and overflowing traffic to other workloads. So there is a lot of value in having a smart inbound processing, similar with waypoints, beyond consistency, other things. I agree with you. It needs to be properly specified as implementation, but it doesn't necessarily need to leak too much into the API.
So when we say inbound, we mean traffic originating from outside the mesh?
No. Traffic coming into a pod which has a sidecar normally go to the inbound interception path, IP tables interception, goes to the listener, and the listener currently just have a bunch of filters and then a pass through to localhost, more or less. I mean, it's more complicated, but.
So it's normally, this logic is normally applied on the client side sidecar, and we would need to apply it on the server side sidecar, is what you're saying?
The logic, it doesn't move. I mean, right now it's applied, for example, authorization policies. We define listeners on the server side, on the port that is listening for captured inbound traffic. I mean, everything that other pods are sending to your pod, we capture pre-authorization policies.
But routes are not currently like that.
But there is no routing because we just have a dumb, just apply. And that's why we have to have path matching duplicated or triplicated. And because everything we do, since we don't have the routing layer, we have to do it in listeners that do their own routing in path matching.
Okay, thank you.
By the way, we're discussing, there was some discussion about this for authorization. context of authorization. It's the same discussion. You know, if we attach authorization to routes, that implies doing the same thing. I mean, WASM seems to be a second case, so that's why I'm, you know, very interested in this.
Right. Yeah. So that's the like authorization today has like matching and rules kind of in one. In theory, you can decouple those, right? There's already a matching API with route, and then the authorization policy can just be who's allowed, or I mean, technically you could put everything, and then it's just allow or deny in the route. But then I guess so I don't know how you split it up. Like if you say path and port and those things belong in route, but you know, identity belongs in the policy. I'm not sure exactly, but
I believe. And Void does allow attaching to route, and for ingress, again, there are a lot of dangers for an ingress gateway to have, you know, routing do one thing and believes that you go to Alice, and then authorization to apply slightly different rules and you go to Mallory. I mean, to go to different
oh yeah,
places.
no, I totally agree. I was just thinking like, I know from an Envoy perspective you can, and you can even attach an authorization policy to a route and then still match on things like path and headers in the authorization policy.
After the routing, which is very safe because you already routed to the right backend.
Right. Yeah, I guess I was just thinking ahead of like how we would explain to users like when you should use one versus the other, given that we have two matching ones. For something like WASM or like these newer ones, they don't have any matching stuff in their API already. So it's easy. Like the answer is just, you know, define a route.
Yeah, my take is if you use the gateway API, you attach to route and you do the right thing. For Istio, it's too late to change. I mean, I don't think that was my thinking. I mean, that we allow authorization policy to attach to routes in gateway gamma. Anyway.
Yeah.
So one other way to do this, John, that I think could meet, you know, your expectations and requirements of not repeating a matching API everywhere and reinventing matching APIs over and over again across Istio, is a reusable type. Think of like a label selector. It's used in maybe a dozen places or more across the Kubernetes API, and yet there's one definition of what a label selector is and how it works. If it's not, I'm just reading up on the comments here, if it's controversial to have WASM attached to HTTP routes, we could have a traffic match object, which then exists. You know, you can leverage traffic match from WASM plugins. You could leverage it from auth policy, all of the places that we need attachment.
And maybe we can leverage it from routing, and then we have routing. And we have one such thing. And it's not easy because it needs to be optimized. It needs, you know, it cannot be a linear search. It has implications on composability. I mean, you know, security, who can attach, where you can attach, if you have a multi.
Yeah, so for instance, Costin, that API exists, right? HTTP route already defines a matching API. Rather than pointing to a route, we could use an instance of that matching API within the WASM plugin and say, here is your HTTP matching instruction. How do you write it? What's its structure? Well, it looks exactly like the Gateway API's HTTP matching instruction.
Yeah, one of the concerns, I agree that you could do that. One of the concerns that I've had with, especially authorization policy, but really applies to WASM because often WASM's for authorization purposes, is the fact that even if they're the exact same API, the fact that they're not a common definition in one place is kind of a security risk. Like I had shown an example at one point where it was like, hey, here's two rules. They set up routing and authorization on these paths. And can you find out why they're wrong because of slight variations in the two matching patterns that actually leads to, you know, everyone being able to access the admin API or whatever. It's very hard to get right. You have to keep them in sync. Now, if it's the same API and same semantics, it's easier because you just copy and paste. But that's still not great, right? But today's API, they're totally different semantics. So it's like very, very hard to actually do it right if you want to say like, you know, apply to this route. I will also say, like, I'm sure we would do it better the 5th or 6th or 7th time, but we do have already common label APIs on our APIs, and by common I mean we have 3 different ones that are all competing to be common. But we can learn from our mistakes there and do it better if we decide to go down that route.
Yeah, I'm not sure we can do it right. I mean, it's fundamentally, we need to replicate everything around the HTTP route, including how you allow a gateway to delegate to a namespace, confuse deputy, all the security changes that had to be done in the gateway API to deal with, ingress and Istio lack of isolation and lack of control over attachment. It will need to be replicated here as well. And if we want to have this reused in waypoints and have some consistent waypoints, I don't know if we can avoid it. I mean, fundamentally, I mean, it's easy to implement something, but it's very hard to satisfy the requirements that HTTP route had to go through without duplicating it. And still, what John said will happen, because if they are not in sync, you have a CV.
So would we go the same route that Linkerd did then, John, and just have a route that has no backend for inbound?
I don't know. It's an option for sure. To me, I'm not sure exactly how they do it now. So when I had first looked at it, they had a fork of HTTP route that was HTTP route, but in Linkerd's group. I don't know what they're doing now, if they're still doing that, or if they, have consolidated on the upstream. They did that because it was like really early and it was alpha. So, like in theory, I like it. But there's still some things to solve. Like we need to say, how does this attach to a sidecar? Like, what is the parent ref, for example? How do we say you can't have a backend? Is it, in some webhook? Is it controller? Do we have our own fork of the API? Like, there's all sorts of things to solve. But it feels close to it feels in the right direction, at least in my mind. I think outbound is, we've talked about outbound a lot. So I think outbound is probably more people are in agreement on route attachment there, I would hope. Although that doesn't directly help Rama, I think it's still something we want to do in general and will be good more broadly.
And I assume we are okay with route attachment for gateways and waypoints.
Yeah, I would consider that in the same category as outbound. Outbound for sidecar is probably the same implementation as the gateways and waypoints, and I think we should do it. Yeah, go ahead, Quat.
For the inbound case, why don't they just use the WASM itself to do matching? I mean, I don't understand why they can't just do match inside the filter.
It's a good question. I don't know. One hypothetical. They said without this capability, path processing logic gets in each of the WASMs, which is cumbersome. Like they certainly can. I guess it's annoying for them. It could also have some performance cost. I don't know.
Performance, yes.
Yeah. I don't know the use case on how bad those impacts are. To me, they seem like they're probably not that bad, but I don't know. I can't speak for them.
I mean, if you have a single part that requires processing with WASM and everything else doesn't, you would have to execute the WASM for everything always.
That's not how it works. You spawn regardless. You just don't. All you save is just one callback, which is fairly fast.
Or callback to start to execute the WASM and then do the path matching in WASM. I mean, it is not trivial.
Well, the filters are created regardless of they match or not. So the code, the fixed cost is always there. Yeah, sandbox is always there. It's not eliminated by matching. It's not lazily created. It's always created at start.
No, it's not about creating. It's about the fact that there is a callback. I mean, crossing boundaries and invoking something in WASM, doing some processing in WASM, and returning for absolutely all requests.
Yeah, that's very small. Like it's inline, right? So it's like, what is it? Maybe like 100 microseconds. I mean,
100 microseconds is huge.
Well, I mean, they can do all kinds of matching in the one filter and then just use that filter matching in other filters, right? Is all the things you discussions you do here, you can do it inside WASM. You can implement non-linear matching if you want to, which Envoy doesn't, and so on.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not possible, but for authorization, for example, is not possible. So it's kind of a larger problem about, do we want to add a general policy route attached to routes? In context of authorization in particular, I'm interested. For WASM, yeah, if that's a solution for them and it is valid, and performance is not a problem, then sure.
Well, if there's no good solution in Istio, I would rather push it to an extension. So if there's no principled way to do this, it's better to push it to the extension author than try to come up with some alpha version of this matching that will just cause headache later on.
Why do you say there is no good way? I mean, applying routes on inbound, it's perfectly legit, and apparently Linkerd is doing so. Doesn't seem crazy.
No, I mean, yes, it makes sense, but it has to be done principled way that is, applies to all policies, not just extensions. If you come up with yet another way to do matching just for WASM, that doesn't seem like a good idea.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like all this stuff should apply to all of our APIs, not just WASM authorization, WASM request auth, telemetry. Telemetry, we already have a bunch of matching, so it's kind of annoying. But I still think the same applies. Although telemetry might have issues and Envoy's limitations on what you can do per route. I'm not sure.
I'm slightly concerned about the complexity of the API here, and that users will have to make yet another choice when they're having to apply policy. Do you want this to apply on inbound or outbound? And today in Istio, at least, you just kind of apply the policy and it gets applied within the mesh. I'm slightly worried about having to open another decision point, let alone have that codified in the APIs. If I'm understanding this, the discussion appropriately. Now where I didn't make sense at all. Does that make sense to folks? Am I not making sense? Any thoughts at all?
I think you're making sense to me, Keith. What I'm trying to wrap my head around is how valid the inbound use case is, how necessary that is. Because if it's a valid and necessary use case, we should find ways to make sure that our API accommodates it. And that did seem to be what I was hearing from others, but I'd be interested in other perspectives there.
Right. Like the calculus in my head is: do we make another API that every user is going to have to? It's going to add complexity to every user that they have to think through, or do we make sure that there's a way to accomplish it? And in that case, like with Quat said about the constant startup time for the WASM sandbox, like that feels like an appropriate place for this complexity. Like we're making it possible to be able to do that traffic filtering, and we keep our APIs simple. I just don't want users to have yet another decision about inbound versus outbound for their policy.
From the sound of things, if we were able to create an inbound route and policy attachment were two routes, effectively, that doesn't sound like any update to the API. I mean, obviously, WASM doesn't yet apply to routes, so that's a change to the API, but that change seems obvious given that all of our other policy is evolving to attach to routes. I guess the question is, how do you indicate that a route is inbound? Is that through the existing API, through some magical label? Obviously, we don't.
That's my question. That's exactly what I'm curious about. Is like, at what point does the user have to consider whether this route or this policy is inbound or outbound, and is the value of that ability sufficient enough to warrant the complexity of the API?
So, I can give you a quick answer. I mean, anything related with security must be inbound. There is no other way. Anything related with load balancing or adding JOT tokens or anything on the egress side must be on the outbound path. There is always, for sidecars, there is always a massive difference in security and in what you can do between the two. I mean, any use case, it's dramatically different. So I don't think we can avoid indicating the side.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but with sidecars, we currently have the client sidecar doing load balancing. There's still auth-z policy on the server sidecar, kind of as a special case. With egress, we again, that's going to be client, if I'm understanding correctly. So I guess my question is, like, out of the use cases you named, which are completely valid use cases, like what's left that's necessitating this? Like that, I'm looking for that 80% use case that's going to really make the lives of that 80% of Istio user base better. And I'm not sure. I'm not seeing the connection as far as what's not already possible today.
You mean as a server side, as a server? Let's call it server and client. I mean, because that's probably easier. You have workload can provide a server and can provide a client and has a client. There are a number of policies that apply for servers, for listeners, real listeners, and a number that applies to clients. There is a very large set of, I mean, I can come with a long list of things that apply to server, but not entirely sure what you're looking for. I mean, what's a?
Well, I mean, so the use cases that you're naming are like Istio users today can specify load balancing things, right? We've got ways to do that, and my understanding of the implementation is that the client sidecar is responsible for implementing that. We have auth-z policy as a sort of a special case. So we're talking about so I see your message, Costin. We're needing server side load balancing specifically. What's possible for what are we enabling via server side load balancing that's not already possible for client side load balancing today?
I don't think it's about load balancing. It's about all policies generally apply on the server. So, and WASM is used to implement those policies. So, I mean, I wouldn't just call it edge cases. Like the majority of cases is security.
Oh, sure. Yes. So yeah, WASM policies, they apply on the server. Again, what I'm trying to figure out is we're talking about a server, an inbound routing API of some sort. Istio has security today. We've got load balancing today. Again, apologies for my lack of understanding. I think what I'm missing is what's the delta that's not possible today for that inbound server side policy gives us. Like if you can enable it for just WASM, if you can apply WASM to the entire server sidecar, and the WASM can do the policy, or that can do the matching that they need. What do we miss? What is that solution missing? Is what I'm trying to understand.
Well, I mean, we just have a gap, right? Our inbound server-side policies have no awareness of paths or headers at all. There's multiple implementations how to do it, and they're not consistent. So I think that the request is just to make them consistent, because there's a general need for path awareness. I wouldn't call them routing, because you don't have to do routing just to match. But because routing always goes to the same backend, it's a server side usually. So it's not really routing. It's just matching.
It's policy attachment to routes. So you reached a particular, so let's say a backend is a destination for 5 routes in the mesh. I mean, different clients route to HTTP routes. You need to know which route was applied and how you were reached. So you can apply the policies to routes to satisfy the same model as ingress, waypoints, and gateway API in general.
I don't like calling routing, because you don't know what route was used to reach you. First of all, the client does not have to tell you what route it used, and so you have to find out.
I completely agree with you. I was just trying to put it in terms of the API we have. I mean, I completely agree. It's very confusing to call it route. I'm not disagreeing.
Right. So it's really about matching, and we have no single matching framework for requests. And every single API has its own, and it is confusing.
So today with auth-z policy, we support route attachment, right, for auth-z policy, and that applies on the server side. Is that correct?
They are not route attached. Again, let's not call it routing, because there's no routing on server side. They are attached these conditions for matching requests based on the headers and paths. And
no, I'm talking about the Istio API, particularly. Yeah. The way that you indicate what traffic is affected by a policy is by attaching to an HTTP route, correct?
No. It's no attachment at all. Attached policies applied on server side regardless of what route is used. But inside the policies, there's additional matching rules, so you can specify properties based on the request, headers and paths and so on, which is not necessarily what was used for routing.
Yeah, so in auth-z policy, you can match the policy based on, path, not path, header, method, etc. But then on WASM, you've got the traffic phase. Then on Envoy filter, you've got another set of matching APIs for whether, I think this is what you're talking about, Quack, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what the ask is to unify the traffic matching API and to make it richer, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, I think the request is to utilize Istio's traffic matching capabilities, so that WASM extension authors don't have to do it in yet another way, which is a reasonable request. And yeah, but Istio does not have a unified matching way, so it's also kind of a moot request, because there's not much to offer.
Because if I understand correctly, even Envoy doesn't have a unified way to match, because the authentic filter is different, or the auth filter is different than the it's technically RBAC filter is different from where you're placing WASM. It's all disparate model, correct?
Yeah, there's multiple ways to match things in Envoy, and yeah, there's an effort to unify them, but that's not happening for the same reasons why it's not happening still, because people are attached to their ways.
For historic reasons as well. I mean, not historic, performance reason. You don't want to, you have a request with headers, with path and everything. You don't want to do, and you have 10,000 routes, because a virtual host, you have many routes. You don't want to perform this operation 5 times. normally most servers, first of all, apply host-based, which is O01 because usually it's a hash table. And then they select some path prefix. I mean, look at pretty much all servers that exist today. And then based on that, they apply additional, regex and other things efficiently. So it's the cost is not, additive. It's a design issue in servers in general. Most servers follow this pattern where you don't do this expensive, especially if it's linear search, which is in many cases the case because you have regex or other things, you could buy efficiency. You want to delay the ON matching, to the last moment and not have it duplicated and done multiple times.
Yeah, I agree. We should try, sublinear lazy matching, but we don't. So like until we have that, it's kind of not useful to expose those to WASM, right?
No, what I'm saying is that even if whatever algorithms we have for the routing, it's better to not apply the algorithm 3 times in a row. Even if it's linear, has to be linear, that's life. But at least you do it once. You don't do the same linear search 3 times or 5 times, depending on how many policies need to apply these common routing policies. And then you have mismatches. That's even worse. Anyway, it's a long discussion.
So you're asking for like a unified matching framework, right? So that every matching only done once, and it's you do it. You don't have to do it every single time for every filter.
Yeah, yes, pretty much. I'm saying, you route first, and after you route, you apply the routing, which is already there. You do at least the host name matching, and then you do the prefix matching that is defined. And then you can do additional routing after you reach the particular. So basically, you are in the context of, what backend you are going to go, what's kind of the intent of the user. And then you can do, additional regex or whatever you want.
Yeah, that fundamentally doesn't work because the point of WASM is to reroute. Sometimes what they want is exactly the opposite, which is to change the routing.
Well, that's perfectly fine. So you should be able to attach to the listener, just like in the Gateway API, or you attach to routes. If you want to attach to listener, that's clear. And the security implication are also clear because if you attach to that's a very highly privileged thing. You can change the entire thing, especially in a gateway. Or if you just attach to a route, then it's a different security context because you only impact things that are already going to your backend.
So, Kostin, you cannot lock the route because the point of this WASM extension is often to do the opposite. Is things like OAuth2, right? You need to be able to change your routing. Unless you can change your routing, you can't write an extension. So you have to allow changing the routing after you execute the extension, which can trigger its own rerouting and its own matching and so on. Right? It's complicated. It's not. You can't just lock the routes once and then have a list of extensions to run.
My thinking was mostly in terms of authorization, but in WASM, I don't know if it is possible to lock the routes or not, but there are two different use cases. You intend to apply to the listener and then change the routing in WASM. That's perfectly valid and should be supported and is supported. And then there is the intent to, apply some WASM with low privileges without the ability to change the routing afterwards. Both of them are valid use cases, I believe. X.Z, for example, you don't want to put X.Z on the listener for absolutely everyone. Anyway, I don't think we'll solve this problem, but we should explore the idea of routing attachment as well.
Jeremy, go ahead.
I have a quick question. I think it's kind of related to what Kostin just ended with about exploring further, but it's kind of general but related to this whole discussion is at what point do we decide we want to like create a design proposal or something? It seems like for one, it's pretty complicated and I'm trying to follow while I drive to pick up food. But I imagine I'm not the only one that thinks this is complicated, so I'm curious to actually see it written down. And then also, just like I've been attending meetings for a while. I think the pattern of discussing a lot of this in the meeting seems to not really result in a lot. I feel like it'd be better if we had a discussion around a document, and then we could kind of contribute offline and then come to it with better understandings of different things. It seems like we're kind of having different understandings or different perspectives about how things work fundamentally. And it just seems like it'd be more productive to talk about it over a design doc. That's just my opinion. I think it'd be useful, especially for me, from my perspective, as a new contributor, to be able to read through it and understand it better. But yeah, I don't think I'm alone, so that's why I wanted to mention it.
That's a good point, Jeremy. I think the question we should be asking right now is this the right time to begin working on route attachment for policy in general across Istio and addressing those concerns? And if so, do we have someone interested in driving that effort?
I would rephrase it in a different way. I think, as John was saying earlier, there is absolutely no controversies at waypoints and gateways. And in general, the gateway API has route attachment as part of the core API, well-defined, with compatibility tests, and it's adopted by other vendors. So there is absolutely no controversy that egress waypoints and ingress should do this. The only thing that is a bit complicated is if we want to spend the implementation time to switch the sidecar inbound, which is the only exception, to be consistent, use the same model, or do we want to invent another way that is applying only to this particular case? I would say that in terms of code reuse, I mean, we could reuse most of the code we are using for waypoints and for ingress. It's just that Linkerd hack or workaround that they did to simplify the problem. And that may be a bit complicated, but the rest is not really rocket science. It's exactly the same thing Waypoint is doing.
There's another caveat to this. Rama is on the classical Istio API. I don't know if he'd be interested in moving to the new API. So that's another caveat to consider too. We have to make a decision for these scenarios, what to do with the classical API. Should we just not supporting them, force the user to move to the new one?
No, I mean, it's not API specific. I mean, the decision will be to implement the inbound listener for sidecars to apply routes. That's pretty much it. And the old API, I mean, is not. Yes, he may need to use, the slightly different, the target refs that he started to the API. That's but it's still the old API, not with workload selector and pretty much everything else. It's not have to switch to the new API. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I'm also working on some doc about around the same thing. I mean, how to keep using the old API with sidecars in an ambient world.
So I think, Jeremy, your feedback is good. Maybe we should comment on the issue, summarize the discussion today, and maybe unless anybody in the call interested in driver design doc, maybe Rama is a good person to drive this forward for the community.
So there are similar discussion about authorizations, and they're still in progress. I mean, internally, and presumably there are some in the gateway working group as well. Maybe we should, spend some time thinking about it and see if it's aligned with the other. I think for authorization is probably even more important because of the security implication risks. And if we do it for authorization, probably we should do it for this. And I think there is a discussion in progress in the gateway as well.
So, Custom, can you maybe share some of the discussion there for us to read offline, just to save everybody's time?
But I think that it's in the gateway working group. John probably has better visibility, but yeah, I can definitely write some doc around it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Should we move to the next topic, or is that topic for the next meeting next week? 14765.
I think someone asked me to add that. I kind of forget who it was, to be honest. Was it Ron, John? Yes. They asked me to add it. They said they don't have access to the right access on the doc. They didn't give me more context, and I don't think they're here. So not sure exactly what they went and discussed. I probably should have asked for more info. Oh, they are here. Sorry. Go ahead.
Hey, John. Hey, everyone. Yeah, so I don't have right access to the doc. I just messaged Mitch, and he told me how to get it. Yeah, so I've been kind of working on some like POCs with like the multi-cluster installation steps, and specifically installing it with Helm. So I was thinking of potentially adding some steps in our doc as to like how to install the control plane and east-west gateways with Helm. So like I found this work item, and I self-assigned. So like once I'm done testing out more stuff, I was thinking of adding that to the doc. I was just curious if there were if anyone else had any suggestions or like any other things to potentially add. I feel like, I don't know if it was this meeting or like in person or something, I felt like a few folks were mentioning some like other broader improvements to the like multi-cluster documentation. I wasn't sure if like wanted to create like a parent task and add some other items, but yeah, just wanted to bring it up here and see what other folks thought. Another thing I was considering was there's like some, I was messaging John about this too, but there's some like multi-cluster settings that you could set through mesh config instead of like values. I wasn't sure if we also wanted to cover that, like alternative multi-cluster configuration steps, or if you guys thought it was better to encourage folks to stick with the traditional like values.yaml for setting these settings.
Maybe I'm missing something. I thought the Istio and the Helm both support values using parameters.
They support differently formatted values files. The Istio operator has its own sort of API and layout. I had been working on a conversion command back in March with KubeCon Chaos. I hope to pick that up again soon.
I think we discussed this in the past, and I don't want to repeat it again. But values.yaml is an install time API intended for the, whoever manages the mesh, and any change requires reinstalling Istio. While mesh config is meant, and all the others are meant as dynamic changes that do not require reinstalling Istio. And the main rule, at least in my opinion, is the change that you are making sufficient to require a revision-based install, and the dramatic change, just like you do a minor version upgrade. So basically, you reinstall Istio, you switch everyone to the new Istio, or do whatever it's, or it's something that can be you just apply something, you make a change in mesh config, and suddenly the entire mesh has a new config, and everything is fine. That's really the main rule, at least from my perspective, between values and mesh config and regular APIs.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I generally agree with that. There were like a few fields. I think it was like values.network ID or something. I think you could set that. Like there was like kind of like an overlap. You could set that in values.yaml, and you could also set like in mesh config. There's like the proxy metadata option. You could set like the proxy environment variable for like. I think it's like Istio meta network ID or something. But in that case, is it like okay in our in the docs to say, oh, you could do both, or should we like push for like one or the other? Yeah, Keith.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm generally wary of the of changing the network of a gateway while it's running. East there's some context here where there used to be like a east-west gateway chart, but then we collapsed to have a single chart for every gateway. And the network ID in the Helm chart is kind of, and that gateway chart is a way to signal that this is going to be an east-west gateway doing the auto C and auto SNI stuff that our east-west gateways do. I would say for proxy config stuff in the mesh config, those are things that, yeah, it's a hodgepodge of stuff. It's just like mesh config. It's hard to tell. You have to take it on a case by case basis. Network, as Costin says in the chat, is one of those that I would not. I don't even know that belongs in proxy config. To be honest with you, you're just asking for incidents. You start changing the network of a gateway at runtime.
Okay. There were two. There was like network ID, which I think is for gateway and proxies, and then there was like values.network gateway, which is specific to the gateway. But I assume you mean like in both cases, you don't want to change that like at runtime.
Correct, because that's essentially the network ID is how the Istio gateway kind of knows what it's going back and forth between networks and the multi-network use case. Changing that is how you start getting black hole traffic for with no immediate explanation. And so having it static on install, and maybe even having guardrails or some organizations might have like a security controls to prevent that from being changed. Like that's the way to go for anything network related or cluster related. For multi-cluster, there's a cluster ID setting in Helm values. I don't know if that's a mesh config either, but like all those things need to stay static, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, cluster ID is or like yeah, it's like cluster name, cluster ID, something like that. That's only you can only set that in values. The only thing I was thinking was like if there are cases where like folks don't want like a full reinstallation and like they just like they already have Istio installed and then like they want to like connect like multiple clusters, like multiple control planes across clusters together. But in that case, would it still be better to just encourage them to like reinstall the control plane with the new settings? Like I guess what Costin was saying was like doing like an upgrade. Sorry.
No, Ben, Ben, go ahead.
I was saying, yeah, I would agree. We don't need to make it hard for ourselves. They can reinstall or install a new revision side by side. And if somebody comes to us with a really great use case for why it absolutely needs to be dynamic, then we can do it then. But we should probably like err on the side of being parsimonious with that.
It's also its own Helm chart too. So if you want to install, if you want to do like a blue-green thing for your east-west gateway, you can install a separate, a new east-west gateway with those settings and cut over with your cloud provider or whatever else.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty much like the main stuff I had to ask about that. So yeah, I don't have anything else to add to that.
I do think we should have an action item here because this is actually a somewhat old issue. We should probably change our documentation for the multi-cluster to try to use Helm instead of Istio operator, the COCTL. It can be a 1.23 push, but I do think that would be a worthwhile change to make, just to make sure folks are using the thing we think is more production ready. Tabs, sure. Yeah, can't see why not. Just for completeness sake, I guess.
Yeah, we're technically not saying don't use Istio Cuddle, so unless we're going to go drop that then.
I mean,
Probably good to have both.
It's
also not that much work to have both, right? They're like pretty much the same thing.
True. It's a separate discussion, but I feel like we set users up with especially for something advanced like multi-cluster. Almost feel like we set users up for a more painful experience because this CTL is, in my experience, less reproducible than Helm. And I remember as an Istio user, and a few years ago, trying to mentally or physically translate what I see on the Istio documentation to my CI/CD pipeline, my Terraform, my whatever, and it wasn't super fun. It's extra complexity, but that's not necessarily in scope for this conversation. Just kind of a personal preference based on my experience.
Yeah, my personal preference is that we can't really remove Istio Kettle for a variety of reasons in my mind. But what we should do is continue to make it more and more like Helm so that it's ultimately like a very, very, very small wrapper around Helm. And then the differences doesn't really matter. It's more like, do you like to use Project Kettle or do you like to use Helm? And you'll get split answers on that, or bad reasons and good reasons. And that's fine because they're pretty much the same thing. But we have to do some work to get there. For what it's worth, that's how Cilium works. Like they have a Cilium Kettle. I think it's just called Cilium actually, but it basically just does like Helm install. So
if you ask the question, you want to use Helm or Istio Kettle, a lot of people will probably answer Istio Kettle. But if you want to ask the question, do you want to use Helm or do you want to use Helm with a wrapper around it, you may get different responses. Because in reality, if someone doesn't want to use Helm, probably they shouldn't use Istio Kettle because Istio Kettle is Helm based. So I mean, it's kind of a bit dishonest to present the problem as it's Helm or something else. It's Helm or Helm with a wrapper. Really, that's.
Yeah, I think my position on Helm and Istio CTLs is less of a technological difference and more of a documentation reader experience sort of approach. I agree that we can't remove Istio Kettle, nor should we. But it's more about the persona of the person reading the documentation, and how can we make them reading the documentation to them following along as enjoyable a process as we can. So like the quick start discussion we had a couple of weeks ago, but yeah, just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay, Naranjan, did you get the input that you need for what you're working on right now?
Yeah, I can, yeah, I think I'm good to get started on that in the next couple weeks or so. You said we're aiming that for 1.23?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, docs wise.
All right. Well, that's the top of the hour and the bottom of the agenda. So that's a nice confluence of events. I imagine I'll see most of you in, 0 minutes at the ambient meeting.
Thanks, everyone. See you.
Bye, folks.